Alpha. Gen Alpha is the term used around the world for the generation of people born approximately from the early to mid-2010s to the mid-2020s. Named after the first letter of the Greek alphabet, A, Generation Alpha is the first entirely born in the 21st century. Most representatives of Generation Alpha are children of millennials, less often, of Zoomers. During the birth of Generation Alpha, many countries around the world experienced a decline in birth rates. Childhood entertainment is increasingly dominated by smart technologies, social networks, and streaming services, while at the same time interest in traditional television is declining. Changes in the use of technology in classrooms and other areas of life have impacted how this generation experiences early learning compared to previous generations. Research shows that allergies, obesity, and health problems related to screen time have become increasingly common among children in recent years. The name Generation Alpha, according to Mark McCrindle, who is usually credited with the term, arose from a survey conducted in 2008 by the Australian consultancy McCrindle Research. In a 2015 interview, McCrindle explained how his team came up with the name Zoomer. Generation Z is a term used worldwide for the generation of people born between approximately 1997 and 2010. Corresponds to generational theory created by William Strauss and Neil Howe. According to the Australian McCrindle Research Centre, representatives of the generation were born in 1995-2009. Psychologist Jean Twenge calls this generation, born 1995-2012, I-generation. Representatives of Generation Z actively use tablets, smartphones, and 3D reality. At their conscious age, the internet is no longer limited to the home computer and can be accessed almost anywhere and at any time thanks to mobile phones, smartphones, or handheld devices. The term Generation Z is often considered synonymous with the term digital native. Generation Z is interested in science and technology. For example, researchers expect many members of the generation will be involved in engineering, biomedicine, robotics, and the arts. In addition, Generation Z is the first generation entirely born during the times of globalization and postmodernism. It is noted that many parents of people from Generation Z work part-time or even take work home, devoting more time to raising children. Society places great emphasis on safety issues. Millennial. Whether the Millennium generation, also the next generation, the network generation, is the generation of people born approximately from 1981 to 1996. Representatives of this generation are called millennials, or Millenites, or echo boomers. They met the new millennium at a young age and are characterized above all by their deep involvement in digital technologies. When the phrase was coined, Generation Y was contrasted with Generation X, which corresponds to the previous demographic generation. The term ILO, Young Liberty Love, is used. The characteristics of a generation vary from country to country depending on political, economic, social, and other conditions. In the United States, those born in 1981-1996 are usually considered to be the Greek generation. However, sociologists do not have a clear starting date for this generation. In the United States, the Y generation is associated with the rise in birth rates that began in 1981, the so-called echo boom. These are mainly children of the baby boom generation, hence the name echo boomers. However, in developed countries, the trend towards a decrease in the number of children in families continues. So the phenomenon of the echo boom is not as widely known as the baby boom itself. Gen X. Generation X is a term applied to the generation of people born between approximately 1965 and 1980. The concept is used in demography, social sciences, marketing, and public culture. As with other generations, it is not uncommon for the boundaries of the birth period established for Generation X to shift within plus or minus a few years, taking into account local realities. Generation X is preceded by the baby boomer generation, and X is followed by Generation Y. The borderline baby boomer X generation includes people born between 1960 and 1964. Boomer. The baby boomer generation, also known as baby boomers or simply boomers, is a term applied in generational theory by William Strauss and Neil Howe to people born between approximately 1946 and 1964. The baby boomer generation is preceded by the silent generation. Representatives of the baby boomer generation lived most of their lives in the USSR during the period of developed socialism. The growing up of baby boomers was influenced by such socio-economic conditions as the restoration of the national economy after the Great Patriotic War, the Cold War. They witnessed the launch of the first Earth satellite, the first manned flight into space. The values of baby boomers are based on the so-called winner psychology. Baby boomers grew up in an environment where the country set big goals and were raised to be ambitious and strive to be the best in their field. Baby boomers are characterized by a desire for personal growth, team spirit, optimism, and responsibility. Baby boomers actively built a career, they can be called workaholics, and they also built a family early. In general, their generation was very active and determined in their youth. As they grew older, baby boomers did not lose their love of life and activity. Now baby boomers occupy the majority of leadership positions, are in power, and run huge corporations. Silent. The silent generation is the generation of people born from approximately 1928 to 1945, following the Great Generation and preceding the baby boomers. According to the U.S. Census, as of 2019, there were 23 million people in this generation in the United States. In the United States, this generation was relatively small because the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II in the early to mid-1940s meant that people were having fewer children. This generation includes most of those who fought during the Korean War. Coming of age in the 1950s, they became leaders of the civil rights movement, as well as the silent majority and creators of the rock and roll music of the 1950s and 1960s. The most striking fact about the younger generation is their silence. Young people, with rare exceptions, are far from being up to the podium. Compared to the fiery youth of their fathers and mothers, today's young generation is a quiet little flame. He issues no manifestos, makes no speeches, and carries no placards. They called it the silent generation. The greatest generation, also known as the GI generation and the World War II generation, is the demographic cohort following the lost generation and preceding the silent generation. The social generation is generally defined as people born from 1901 to 1927. They were shaped by the Great Depression and were the primary generation composing the enlisted forces in World War II. Most people of the greatest generation are the parents of the silent generation and baby boomers, and, in turn, are the children of the lost generation. An early usage of the term, the greatest generation, was in 1953 by U.S. Army General James Van Fleet, who had recently retired after his service in World War II and leading the 8th Army in the Korean War. Lost. The lost generation is a generation of people who were born before, and according to some sources during, the First World War, that is, people born, according to various estimates, around 1883, 1900, or 1890, 1918. This generation is characterized by the fact that many of its representatives could not adapt to peaceful life after the war. They became drunkards, went crazy, and committed suicide. The term appeared in the 1920s-1940s. This concept was popularized by his novel The Sun Also Rises, 1926, in which he placed as one of the epigraphs, "You are all a lost generation." Gertrude Stein, in Conversation. Michael Cowley, publisher, writer, and historian of American literature of the Parisian post-war period, wrote that the term, which became known thanks to Gertrude Stein, for a long time corresponded to the definition given by her. In his opinion, the reasons were a separation from their roots, a separation from previous religious and other cultural traditions. This generation was lost because it was prepared for a different life.